Dr. George Murphy has been active for many years in helping churches see the relevance of science for faith and deal with religious issues raised by science and technology. With a PhD in theoretical physics from Johns Hopkins, he taught college science courses in the United States and Australia for 12 years. He received his MDiv from Wartburg Seminary and was pastor of St. Mark Lutheran Church in Talmadge, Ohio from 1984 to 1999, and a pastoral associate at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Akron, Ohio from 1999 to 2008. So he retired just last year from regular parish ministry, but he continues to write and speak on issues of science and theology, and he's an adjunct faculty member at Trinity Lutheran Seminary in Columbus, Ohio. Dr. Murphy has published many papers in physics, as well as articles in Science Theology Dialogue in various publications, and he writes the Handiwork column on issues of science and technology for a Lutheran publication, Lutheran Partners. His most recent books are Pulpit Science Fiction, which I love that title, The Cosmos in the Light of the Cross, which I have a couple of copies here available. Earlier books are Toward a Christian View of the Scientific World, Cosmic Witness, and The Trademark of God. He has spoken at conferences and retreats for clergy and laity, seminaries and universities, and taught television courses on theology and science and religion. He served on the task force that developed the Evangelical Lutheran Church's Caring for Creation statement, and on a committee for the Episcopal Diocese of Ohio that produced a report on the Incarnation and the Internet. And for years, he was a member of the steering committee of the ELCA Alliance on Faith, Science, and Technology. Dr. Murphy has written for several services that provide Internet resources for preachers. So you can see that he has crossed over some denominations. In fact, last month, he was down at the Union Seminary in Richmond, which is a Presbyterian seminary, working with the Presbyterian Association on Science, Technology, and Christian Faith. So this is an issue that crosses a lot of boundaries. That's what we're interested in here. So, George, I'll just let you take it over from here, and we'll make sure you're with us. Thank you.
I thought when we were looking at that segment on the repair of the Hubble, there's an effect that physicists sometimes refer to called the Heisenberg effect, which is the ability of theoretical physicists to break laboratory equipment without touching it. And thinking of the first day of the cruise that my wife and I took this past summer, on which I carefully dropped her camera on the deck of the ship and ruined it, so we had to buy a new one in our first place on shore, made me very happy that I was not anywhere near the Hubble. I'd like to begin with a passage of Scripture that you're probably not the most familiar one. When we talk about spiritual gifts, we usually think of churchy things, prophecy and ministry and healing, maybe things like this. 31st chapter of Exodus. The Lord spoke to Moses, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with divine spirit, with ability, intelligence, and knowledge in every kind of craft, to devise artistic designs, to work in gold, silver, and bronze, in cutting stones for setting, and in carving wood in every kind of craft." And it goes on in that way, several verses. Technology, in this case in a rather elementary form, technology is a spiritual gift when it is in the service of God. And that's one way in which I think we ought to be thinking of the kinds of things that I hope to encourage for people in science and technology and medicine and all those related things to view your gifts in that spirit. We have in our occasional services book a little service for the affirmation of the vocation of Christians in the world. And I thought it would be appropriate to start with a prayer from that service. Let us pray. Almighty God, you have blessed each of us with unique gifts, and you have called us into specific occupations, relationships, and activities using those gifts. Enable us to use our talents to witness to our faith in you and to communicate your love to the people we meet each day. Empower us to be ministers of your reconciliation, love, hope, and justice. Keep us steadfast in our commitment to serve actively in your name. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. What I want to talk about today is how scientists, and I'm using that phrase as a kind of catch-all because I'm including engineers, people in technology, medical fields, and so forth, so I won't list all that separately. And all of those today, of course, have a very strong scientific component. Talk about the way in which scientists can make use of their gifts, or maybe I should say better, how God can make use of their gifts in the service of the church. Now, particularly in the churches of the Reformation traditions, there's been a strong emphasis, you have it in Luther certainly, in Calvin and others, of all lawful callings on land and sea, as the old language goes, as vocations, as callings from God. That is, a vocation in that sense is not simply a call to parish to be a pastor. Everything that we are called to do in the world, we are called to do in service to God and our neighbor. That is a kind of ministry. In the back there, and maybe you can pass those around, Paul. There's those handouts. I'll say more about those at the end. But it's a list of resources. Most of them, almost all of them, some books. And the first one of those is a book by Walter Hearn, whom those of you who've been in ASA will know of. Walt's been very active in ASA for many, many years. And it's called Being a Christian in Science, published about 12 years ago. And while it's directed largely to young people who are considering science, going into science, I think it's valuable for everybody in contemplating what it means to be a Christian in science. And the fact of the matter is, the church as a whole has not done a terribly good job in helping people in the sciences to understand what they do as callings from God. And that's one of the realities that we have to confront. Now, and let me say before I get rolling here, I am quite capable of talking at you straight for an hour without a break. And that's not really my intention. So if you got a question, if you object to something I say or whatever, please put up your hand and let me know. I mean, I'll pause occasionally and say, are there any questions? But you don't have to wait until I do that because I may forget. So when we're talking about vocations, that there is a tradition, and it still continues to be the case in Protestant churches, even though theoretically we shouldn't talk this way. You know, when you say somebody has a vocation, you mean he's going to go to the seminary or she is going to go to the seminary and become a pastor. And that's a limited, that of course is an important vocation, but it's not the whole story there. All of our callings, we're called to serve God with whatever particular talents and in whatever situation God has placed us. Now, that vocation is generally carried out in the world, okay, in the laboratory, at your computer, wherever it may be. That's where you carry out that vocation. And we are called to be ministers in those different fields, Monday through Saturday. Serve God in all of those situations when you're at a scientific meeting or something like that. Take that for granted. And it's not that easy, perhaps, because something is we need to remember Monday through Saturday. We are called by God to serve God in what we're doing here. But the question I want to focus on especially is how can we contribute to the work of the church as scientists, as people in all these different fields? How can we contribute to the work of our local congregation? How can we contribute to the work of the larger church? Rather telling story that one of the bishops in the Evangelical Lutheran Church told. Harold Lohr he's retired now, but Harold Lohr, before he went into pastoral ministry, was a nuclear chemist. He has a doctorate in nuclear chemistry, and he was working in that field. And he tells about when he was sort of beginning to consider, what does God really want me to do with my life? Speaking to his pastor at that time and asking that question, how could he contribute as with his particular expertise and so forth? How could he contribute to the work of the church? And the pastor stopped to think for a minute and said, well, we do need more ushers. Now, a lot of people might get that response, not necessarily a scientist. But the fact is, people in a lot of fields, musicians, accountants, plumbers, lawyers, and so forth, people in a lot of different fields, the church can think, oh yeah, people have this such and such skill, we can use this. The church doesn't have a terribly good idea of how to make use of people in science or technology. Now here's a place I should say that while I'm lumping everybody together as a scientist, this is an area, of course, in which people in medical fields are in a somewhat different situation. Because there are a lot of things like medical missionary, parish nurse, a lot of things like that, where there are clear contributions that those people can make. So that's a little bit different, but nevertheless. Now, so the question is, how can you contribute? And I'm posing the question to you. I do pose this question to pastors as well, and challenge church leadership to think about this. But the reality is, you need to think about this. Because if you don't, probably your pastor won't. Okay? There's someplace where scientists need to be proactive in dealing with this, most of the time, at least. So, how can you contribute? Depends on a lot of things, obviously. It depends on what your particular expertise is in some area of science or technology. Depends on other things about you, what particular skills you may have, whether you're good in teaching. Not everybody who's got a PhD is a good teacher, and you all remember from graduate school. Or some of you do at least. It depends on your interpersonal skills. It depends on what administrative abilities you may have. So, a lot of other factors besides just particular scientific area of expertise. But there are other factors as well. There is the theology and practice of your particular church. If you are in a church that has, in which the leadership and the traditions of that church have some fundamental objections, let's say, to evolution or to some other things, then there's some constraints that you've got to deal with. And what the views of the pastor of the church and other church leaders are is going to have a lot of influence here. Now, I don't simply want to discuss those things in the abstract. And so I want to just kind of look at some possibilities for service in church and see how those different factors come in as we go along. Now, there are a lot of things that may happen. Sometimes, indeed, now I say you need to be proactive. That's not always the case. It's possible if there is some news item about some particular scientific discovery that may get people's interest. Just in the last few weeks, beginning of October, there was this announcement of the results about Ardi. You know what I'm talking about here? The Ardipithecus, nicknamed Ardi. The oldest hominidae, hominid fossils, about 1 million years older than Lucy, and therefore getting us a lot closer to the split between humans and apes, and giving us a great deal of information about what early humans were like, in some cases surprising, not as much like chimpanzees as paleontologists had expected. So that kind of thing is on the front page of the newspaper. Some spectacular Hubble discovery. Sometimes some particular genetics discovery. They discovered the gene for X, which may turn out not really, that goes. But nevertheless, that can be in the news. And people may be interested in this and talk to the pastor about it, and the pastor or somebody might say, hey, why don't you lead an adult forum on this topic if they know you're a scientist and know something about this kind of thing. Might happen. There might be some other situation in which the pastor or somebody else in the leadership of the church would ask for assistance and guidance on something. But Most cases, that is not going to happen that way. In most cases, the role of the scientist is, as I said, to be proactive. Or to use other language, it is, and I borrow a term here from the liberation theologians, where they talk about the need to conscientize people, okay? To make them aware of the situation, make them aware that something needs to be done, to make people aware you're oppressed. I mean, that's where you're talking about liberation theology, that to see what their situation is and see that something can be done about it, and to form the conscience of people and of communities. Well, a major part of our task, people who are interested in science and theology, is to conscientize the church about the importance of these issues that are related to science and technology. And that may not be easy sometimes, and as is the case with liberation theologians, it may get you in trouble. Okay? You can cause controversy by trying to do that kind of thing. And so you need to be aware of the possibilities for either controversy or benign neglect. And so I don't want to just be negative to start, but we need to be realistic. So let me talk about that. In some churches, some, if not all, issues related to science are controversial. Now, especially that is true, for example, for Big Bang cosmology, for evolution, and there are other issues, cloning, sexuality, you can think of other issues. And the pastor of the church, or the church leadership in general, may want to avoid stirring up trouble, even if the pastor doesn't have any particular problem with it. Okay, I mean, I know this is going to cause trouble if we start talking about this a lot, so let's just cool it down. Now, that's the case in more conservative churches. In other churches, and I think now more of mainline Protestant churches, like what I'm mostly familiar with, the Evangelical Lutheran Church or the Episcopal Church, you're not likely to have that problem so much. I mean, clergy are not likely to be opposed to evolution. But the problem there is it's very often seen as something that is peripheral to the real message of the church. Okay? What does that have to do with the gospel? Now, that's a legitimate question, I think, and I was just talking about that in our class here this morning. But sometimes what does this have to do with the gospel is not saying, how do we make this connection? It's sort of a way of fending off these issues and saying we don't really need to talk about those because those really aren't at the heart of the gospel. And there are currents in 20th century theology that where a lot of mainline clergy have been educated that encourage that kind of thinking. God created the world, and then people sinned, and then Jesus came, and that's what we talk about. Okay? And so all the issues related to science aren't really so important. A similar response, one that's related, is when you bring up the issue of science and faith or evolution and creation, people may say, I don't have any problem with that. I think of an experience I had. I've been a member of the Evangelical Lutheran Church's group on science and faith and technology. And one of the things we wanted to do one year is for people in the different synods of the church at our synod assemblies to have a display about this group to let people know who might be interested. There's this group who's interested in this kind of thing. And I don't know how they do this in your churches, but you have a chance to have sort of put up displays for various groups and advertise things. Well, so I did one for the group on science and technology, and the response of several people coming up and looking at it was a very positive presentation. But people would come up and look at it and say, I don't see why there has to be any problem. Who said there was? But they're immediately assuming that I'm saying there's a big conflict here that we have to deal with. And so very often when people say, I don't have a problem with that, it's just saying I'm not interested in it. And let's be honest, there are problems in dealing with the relationship between Christian faith and science. That doesn't mean there has to be conflict, but there are serious issues that have to be wrestled with. You know, how do we talk about God's activity in the world, particularly in the bad stuff that happens? Okay, I mean that just to take one simple example. Okay, so there's serious issues that have to be wrestled with, and I don't have a problem with that. It's not an adequate response.
Dr. Ruth?
Yes.
Do you ever, I mean, it seems like we should challenge that. I mean, that's fine that an individual doesn't have a problem, but it is a conflict in our society.
Right, yeah.
It would be like, I could say, I don't have a problem with what's happening in Darfur because I get up in the morning
Right.
and put my kids in my minivan, and the truth is it doesn't really affect me.
Sure.
But I'm a Christian. I should have a problem
Sure.
with
Good point.
that conflict existing and the fact that we're called to be peacemakers.
Good point. And so one response, if people say we don't have a problem with that, is, well, I'm glad of that, but a lot of people do have a problem with it, and it's something that for many people, that keeps some people from really giving the gospel serious consideration. And you know, so it is a difficulty, and it's something the church needs to work with. So, right, that's a very good point.
Well, and also the positive side is that there's more to it than just deciding whether or not there's a problem.
Sure.
There's all these positive things that the church can be doing with science and technology that maybe the church isn't doing. So it's
Right.
more, it's in addition to just dealing with whether or not there's a conflict, there's look what we could be doing.
Their ministry opportunities.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, and that's what we want to pursue here, is the positive aspects of that. Now, but you know, at the same time, recognizing we have to deal with these issues of tension that do exist. So, some clear efforts, sensitive efforts, but clear efforts need to be made to get both clergy and lay people here, and I'm using that in the church sense, to see the importance of science and technology issues to the church, in what the church does and what the church says. And now, you know, you can make small contributions in very small ways. You know, buy Francis Collins' book or a book by John Polkinghorne and donate it to the church library. Now, the problem there is people very seldom read the books in the church library. They usually gather dust, so you need to make an effort to let people know that it's there. But, you know, you can do very small things like that. But I hope that we do more than just that. So I want to look at some of the ways that you can contribute to the work of the church. And let me pause at this point and see if there are any. I've kind of been making some general comments to this up to now, and let me pause to see if there are any other questions before I go on. And also, if I find the second page of my notes. Here we are. That's nice. Yes.
I would just comment that probably one of the intersections of the medical sciences and theology would be in, you know, the whole area of psychiatric problems.
Right.
I mean, which would directly relate, say, to pastoral counseling and what pastors say to their congregation in general. Like, you know, I know people who, you know, probably need to be on something like a SRI inhibitor, but,
Right.
you know, they're told by people in their family, you know, that Christians shouldn't go on that. All you need is the Lord to,
Yeah.
you know, deal with this problem.
Yeah, and if you've got expertise in that area of psychology or psychiatry, you know, letting the pastor know, or, you know, others who do pastoral counseling, letting them know that you're available to, you know, be supportive and be a resource if you can help them. You know, that doesn't mean that you're saying, I'll do your counseling for you, but that you would be able to be supportive of them if they would be able to make use of your expertise. I mean, that would be one thing. Yeah. Anything else? And in fact, let me pick up on that, because that's not just stop with that. It's not just not just true with psychiatric things. More and more, pastors often have to deal with issues that are related to well, let's say in general, prenatal issues, and particularly things connected with genetics. I mean, couples who are considering having children, if they're aware that there are genetic problems, history of genetic problems or possibility of that, if they're talking to the pastor about that, now they're probably seeing a genetic counselor there. And the pastor is not the genetic counselor. But the pastor ought to know something about what he's dealing with when he's talking to this couple. And in fact, this one of the books on that list that I have, the one near the bottom, first one in the last category it says for preachers, but this is really more for pastoral counselors. That book by Ron Cole Turner and Brent Waters, Pastoral Genetics, is precisely for that. It is a resource for anybody who's doing pastoral counseling on issues of genetics, so they won't be clueless when they're talking to people who are dealing with those issues. So yeah, I mean that's one area in which people with appropriate kinds of expertise can be helpful and be supportive to the church. One very obvious way in which people can contribute is in teaching. And in fact, that's perhaps the most obvious thing. And so doing something like teaching a class or leading an adult forum or whatever it may be called is one thing that can be done. I would suggest starting with adults. It's kind of easier to deal with adults, easier to get it in there. Teaching high school students and junior high is, that's important too, and I don't want to rule that out. But starting with adult classes is maybe the easiest entree. So you could do this. You could suggest this to the pastor or the parish education committee or whatever else it might be. I think this is an important topic. I'd like to teach say a 4-week class for adults on science and religion, and or something of that order. I say don't make it too long. Don't say I want to teach a class for this whole year on science and religion, because you're going to overestimate your staying power perhaps on that, and you're certainly going to overestimate the persistence of the people there, probably. You want to keep it relatively short, 4 weeks, 6 weeks maybe. And don't begin with creation and evolution. Don't say we're going to start out, we're going to have a class on creation and evolution. Don't, in any case, don't ever use the phrase creation or evolution. If you do, I know where you live, okay? As soon as you say creation or evolution, you've sold the farm. The issue is how you relate to the two things together, rather than saying we immediately going to start with the assumption that they're incompatible. So you don't want to start with some really flammable topic. Start with something kind of low-key faith science survey. And you can touch on the controversial topics in doing that. I mean, you don't want to ignore questions about creation and evolution. You don't want to ignore the Big Bang and so forth. But that's not your focus. You do a sort of general survey and see what may raise interest for people, what may get people upset. Okay? So they're likely, if you do something on this, people are going to say, when you've talked about genetics and all the issues related to that, we really ought to talk more about this. We ought to have a whole class on this. Well, okay, that gives you a tip-off. Okay, that's what can be done next. And you file that away for future reference. People get real upset about some topic, okay, we've got to handle this with some care. So that's would be the first way to approach this, I think. Yes?
Wesley Theological Seminary, just down the road, actually put together a really good resource. It's hosted by Francis Collins. It's called Science and Religion, Pathways to Truth.
Okay.
And it's a DVD-based discussion, so there are about 9 segments. Each segment is hosted by a different scientist or theologian.
Okay.
But that's a really good resource that's out there.
Okay, do you know the website or anything for that?
Cokesbury.com is Cokesbury.
Okay, but I mean of the particular one, the particular course you're looking for. What is it called?
Oh, it's called Science and Religion, Pathways to Truth.
Give me that blue thing there.
I should have said, before I started, yeah, there are a lot of resources, and on that handout I've listed.
But it was put together right with Wesley Theological Seminary, just down the road.
Okay.
And I think you can
I've
order it.
heard really good things.
It is really well done.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, but that's available through Cokesbury.
Well, it's DVDs with lectures. All of them Francis Collins introduces. Then he may have a guest lecturer from Oxford or Cambridge or somewhere else. Then there are detailed suggestions for class discussion.
Okay, great. Yeah, so there's a resource that you can use. I didn't have that one down. And, this kind of illustrates what I said maybe earlier. Well, I guess I'm thinking of what I talked about this morning. There's been a tremendous growth in materials dealing with religion and science over the last 30 years. When I started getting into this kind of thing in the mid-1970s, there was very little that was particularly interesting that was published in this area. Not very many resources, conferences, and so forth. There's a whole lot of stuff available. Unfortunately, not a great deal of it is particularly useful for church classes. A lot of it's more academic type of stuff. But that's one good resource. Yes, Paul.
Yeah, I ought to just mention that this is an area that George has taken to heart, and he has some of the books, the titles of the books that I mentioned, Toward a Christian View of the Scientific World, I think, and Cosmic Witness, they have some studies in there with verses and various things that are designed for classes, church classes. So
Yeah.
He's taken that on as a...
Yeah, I'll say a little bit more about that there, but that's true. Yeah, Jen?
Okay, well, as long as we're advertising things, there's a wonderful book that I contributed to called Not Just Science, Questions Where Christian Faith and Natural Science Intersect. And Dorothy Chappell is one of the editors. She's Dean of Science at Wheaton College. And each chapter is by a different expert in a field of science or technology, who is a Christian, writing about what the sort of frontline questions are in that field, and not answering all the questions, but kind of setting up a healthy framework for discussion, and then at the end of each chapter there are discussion questions. So it's perfect for a church adult Sunday school class, or a Bible study group, or book study group, or even for personal reflection, because each little bite-sized chapter can stand alone. And I wrote the chapter on astronomy.
Who publishes that?
I think it's Zondervan.
Okay.
I should know that, but
What's the title again?
it's called Not Just Science, and then the subtitle is something like Fundamental Questions Where Christian Faith and Natural Science Intersect.
Yeah, well, that just not just science, especially
Yeah,
the other
right.
would get it. Yeah.
Right.
Now, there are things you need to remember, you need to bear in mind about this teaching class. Teaching adults, adult classes in church, has some similarities with teaching college, but it's not the same thing. Okay, it's not the same as teaching a
Can't
class.
give big homework assignments.
Well, yeah, in particular, people will not do, and I'm talking about people who are really interested and you have the best will in the world, but you're not going to get people to read homework assignments. It's fine to have a book, like one of these books, or I mentioned a couple of others here. It's fine to have a book available for people who want to buy it and read it. But don't say, for next week, read chapters 8 and 9 and expect that everybody's going to do it. Okay? They're probably not. Because a significant number of the people in the class who come next week won't have been there the previous week. Because you sometimes get rather irregular attendance. I usually try to limit myself to a one-page handout, preferably one-page double-spaced, where you hit the main points that you're going to talk about, and give some references if people really want to pursue it further. But be realistic about that. You're probably going to get some lack of continuity. We're not going to be here for the next 3 weeks, Pastor. We're going on vacation in Arizona, or whatever. No, let's be realistic. You need to, and also you get breaks because of the church programming. You know, we're going to have our stewardship fair next Sunday, and there won't be any adult classes. You know, all that kind of thing. So it's, you know, you have to go with the flow. You have to be able to popularize the science. You want to try to be accurate. You don't want to lie to people, but you cannot present very technical explanations of things. You have to keep it fairly simple. One good possibility is team teaching. You can do this, a scientist and a pastor could do this, okay? Because the pastor, after all, is supposed to be the teaching theologian of the congregation. And by the way, if any pastor says, I'm not a theologian, then you've got a problem with that person, but that's a whole different issue. You know, so team teaching with, and it doesn't mean that the scientist can't say anything about the theological aspect or the theologian can't say anything about the science, but, you know, that's an approach. Or people from a couple of different scientific disciplines. Now, I don't want to suggest, though, that if you're a chemist, the only thing that you should ever talk about is chemistry. You have to be something of a generalist if you're going to do this. You have to know enough, have a, you know, and if you don't have it, you know, go back and brush up on some of these things that you took when you were in college or whatever. But you have to have a kind of general interest in science, not just focused on one specific area. My doctoral advisor, when my office mate and I didn't want to go to the colloquium that week because it was a subject we weren't interested in, he would say, you guys are a couple of pinheads. Don't be pinheads. Now, having done what I suggested, that is, you start with a kind of general course and look for the possibility of spin-offs. Well, what kind of spin-offs do you have? You can probably think of a lot of these yourself. And you can do astronomy in the Bible. Now, clearly you want to go beyond the astronomy that's just in the Bible, okay, or whatever implications there are. But, you know, you're going to talk about the Big Bang and cosmology and the formation of the solar system, and, you know, things like that. Talk about creation and evolution. And again, please, you know, keep them together. That doesn't mean you have to necessarily agree that they fit together smoothly, but nevertheless, you got to approach that in that spirit. And how do we think of these together? And there are really a whole lot of subcategories of this. I mean, that's a very big topic, and there are a lot of smaller areas that you could discuss in that connection. This was years ago when there were some things in the news, again using that as and sparking people's interest, a lot of news items about some of the recently discovered cave paintings in France and Spain. Some of which seem to have sort of religious or spiritual symbolism and so forth. And one of my parishioners asked me about, you know, how does this fit together with the Bible kind of thing. And the long and short of it is I did a short class, a couple of weeks, that I called What Was God Doing in the Stone Age? And, you know, it's a sort of topical thing. You know, quite admittedly, I took off from this news item and, you know, gave you an opportunity to look at some of these issues and something that was in the public consciousness. Now, the area of biomedical ethics. And again, here, you could do a general thing on biomedical ethics and look at general principles, look at prenatal issues, the genetic questions, organ donation and transplant, end-of-life issues, cloning, genetic engineering, and do a sort of quick look at those various things. I did something, or you can do more specialized things just on one of those areas. And if you're going to talk about end-of-life issues, you're going to have a fair number of people my age and, you know, around 50s and 60s who've got elderly parents who are getting concerned about that sort of thing. If you've got young people, couples, these questions about prenatal issues, genetics, and so forth, is going to be important. On my experience, if people who have had organ transplants and their families often can get rather evangelical about that. You know, don't send your organs to heaven, we need them on earth, and that kind of thing, and people who are interested in that kind of thing. So there are a lot of specialized topics that can be dealt with. In that area, in the issue of biomedical ethics, a lot of church bodies have produced resources dealing specifically with that, with issues of genetics or end-of-life issues and so forth, and produce statements and study guides and so forth. Environmental theology is another area. You know, the whole caring for creation thing. Now here, the response of some people to all of that is, you know, what is there special for the church to say? I mean, we hear about this in the news all the time. Well, it's important to convey to people that there is a distinctively Christian understanding that makes it important to take care for creation seriously. That is, we are not just sort of tagging along on the secular environmental movement when we talk about the calling of human beings to be caretakers, stewards for creation. And so we need to talk about the theology of that, you know, what the biblical rooting of it, chapter 25 of Leviticus with the year of Jubilee and so forth. And that doesn't mean that you leave out the economics or the politics of it, but you put that in theological context. A lot of other things you could do. You talk about artificial intelligence, things like that. Again, depending on what people are interested in, you know, that's going to be part of it. If you don't feel that you're expert enough in this, you know, find somebody who is. Now, let me suggest one other approach. I'm sorry, is there a question here? Yes?
It just occurred to me, you mentioned these local areas for Christian teachers to speak about
Right.
in the context of the congregation. I don't understand, what is your objection to discussing these things with young people, that is, high school students and junior high, who are forming their career goals and who are forming their spiritual goals at that time?
Well, okay, I'm sorry if I gave the impression that I objected to that. I don't. I've simply meant that I think it's probably easiest to start with adults. You're gonna.
Well, they won't give you as much slack as the kids will, but
Exactly.
the kids will be honest.
Well, exactly. No, I quite agree. You need to do that. But I simply mean that you have an easier entrance into doing it with adults. It's going to be easier to talk to the pastor and say, hey, you know, why don't I lead an adult forum on this subject, than it is to say, can I lead a couple of sessions for the 8th grade confirmation class? Because that's sort of already set up and structured, you see. So, but you're quite right. I think, and I'm going to get...
That's the critical time.
I agree. I agree. But also realize this, and no argument at all with what you're saying. But also, in helping, in dealing with this with adults, you're also helping to develop an atmosphere in the church of, you're increasing the comfort level for dealing with those issues. That's another important thing that you need to help to work at. Okay, it's very important. Even if you never get to any details about the Big Bang or DNA or anything like that, simply giving people, and especially giving young people, even very young kids, the feeling that the church is comfortable talking about these things. You know, that's a really critical step in making them aware that talking about evolution, well, maybe the 5-year-olds may not know about evolution, but, you know, talking about dinosaurs and galaxies and things like that is something that's quite okay, and the church is happy with that. And then gradually they can get the idea talking about evolution is something the church is happy talking about. Yeah.
I have a sort of a difficult question, but
Or somebody else can answer.
what do you do if you're the pastor and you don't have a science background, and someone comes up to you, just like you suggested, and says, look, I have a science background or an interest in science, and I would like to teach a multi-week course on science. Now, I've seen that happen in different churches in 3 different ways. One church was the person asked that and was given granted permission and led an entire semester course, basically really pounding in the young earth creationist view. And then I've been in another church setting where someone, in fact, you're probably familiar with it, with Hugh Ross, who's is a good trained scientist, but his take is more of the intelligent design view and is really interested in getting churches to talk that perspective. And then there's other perspectives that would see more of a theistic evolution sort of. So if you're a pastor, how do you discern whose scientific and theological viewpoint to allow to have the podium?
Now, see, you're
If you're a
asking.
congregant, how do you discern which, all this kind of...
See, now you're asking me to do my workshop for clergy.
Okay.
Because the other side of this, I don't want to make this sharp split, but I mean that you're calling attention to the need for some degree of scientific literacy by pastors. Because the pastor ought to know enough, especially that if somebody comes and says, I'm going to teach this course in science and religion, you have to say, no, okay, what sort of approach are you going to take? What sort of things are you going to discuss? Well, I'm going to prove that radioactive dating doesn't work and the world's really only 6,000 years old. I mean, they may not say it that bluntly, but then the pastor ought to say, hold on here a minute. I'm not a professional scientist, but I know that that's sure not what most scientists think. I mean, pastors ought to be able to do that. But you're quite right. If pastors had no scientific literacy at all, they're kind of helpless in the face of that kind of thing.
I mean, in that sense, I'm almost sympathetic to the ones who say, let's not have any of this because they don't want to let some particular viewpoint in that might be skewed,
Well, but see, there's also a theological issue with some of those things.
Yeah.
That they ought to know about.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's why it's important for, and why I do the kind of thing I do in the course I teach and a lot of other seminary courses of trying to do some education for pastors on this kind of thing. Yeah. Yes.
A lot of the mainline denominations, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but I think, their church has a college student. I'm a United Methodist.
Right.
And just last year, our general conference, which is the only body that speaks for our denomination, adopted 3 evolution-friendly resolutions. And so the polity of our church is that that a pastor has to stick to that, or at least offer it up before they were to venture into, say, intelligent design or something else. So that the polity of the church says that they're supposed to. And I think the Presbyterians have something similar.
The Presbyterians do. And a number of the churches, even if they don't have an official statement that says evolution is true and you better believe it, nevertheless have science religion groups like the one that the ELCA has, the Episcopal Church, United Methodist, the UCC, a number of others, and that are resources for for pastors that could contact if they needed to find out about some of this. But yeah, I mean, you need to take into account what the stand. But let's be realistic. In most churches, especially Protestant churches, people, including clergy, don't pay much attention to that sort of official statement. I mean, I had a woman at St. Paul's who was very strong, don't people realize that the Episcopal Church has taken an official stand against the death penalty, against capital punishment? Well, I had to tell her, look, I mean, this may very well be true, but the fact is probably most Episcopalians don't know that, and many of them don't agree with it. Okay. So, I mean, yeah, your point is well taken, but that I think is of limited value.
Yeah, I don't think the people in the pews know about it, but I think the book tends to live in church offices so that pastors and lay professionals go and say, that's a good question. What does the discipline say?
But, I, as Paul mentioned in my introduction, I was on the task force that developed the ELCA's statement on the environment, caring for creation. And I'm sorry to find out how many people in the ELCA congregations and pastors have never heard of the thing. I mean, they may have been mailed a copy, but there are lots of copies sitting on the distribution service in Chicago gathering dust. So, it's the way of the world.
Now, one other thing, I'm sorry, another comment here?
Well, I don't know if this is the right time or not, but my pastor has asked me to do a forum, kind of a one-shot thing on age of the earth. And we're just starting it. It's a small startup church. We still meet in rented quarters,
Okay.
100 people maybe. So I'm just wondering, I remember you said I'm in contact with evolution, don't bring those up
Well, there,
separately, or...
if you've been asked to do something on the age of the earth, you need to talk about what the age of the earth is.
Yeah.
And the age of the earth is 4.5 billion years, and ain't 6,000 years.
Yeah, so I'm going to be stepping on a few people's toes, but I'm kind of sampling the congregation. I think most people are older, so I feel pretty comfortable. They say, don't worry, Tim, you're among friends and all that. But one complicating factor is that we were sort of formed to reach out to internationals.
Right.
And there's a lot of Chinese that have come in, and they're being, I think, won over to Christianity with some of these anti-evolution books that are written by American creationists.
Yeah.
In fact, we still have one on our table, and I told the pastor's wife, that thing's full of baloney. I saw the translation on the web, and it's just filled with ridiculous things. So that makes it a little tough.
It can be a tough situation, and I think one of the things you want to talk about is the question of, is there ever any clear statement in Scripture about what the age of the earth is? And the answer is no.
Yeah.
I mean, it requires a lot of inferences, the assumptions that you've got to put into your reading of the Bible, particularly what kind of literature are the early chapters of Genesis. And you've got to make a lot of assumptions there before you can say, Scripture teaches that the earth is such and such years old. Yeah.
I think I'm a director of Christian education with a background in evolution.
Okay.
Which is strange, but I think it's helpful before you sort of jump into the facts of like the age of the earth to spend some time. There's a little deconstructing that has to happen,
right.
And it's helpful to talk about how there are different kinds of truth.
Right.
Science truth versus other truths. It's worth pointing out to people how science is not the same as scientism, like the kind that Dawkins preaches, and to do a little deconstruction of that sort of thing. I would guess that, particularly, you're speaking of Chinese immigrants, coming from the oppression of a communist system, are probably very sensitive to anything that smacks of materialism.
Yeah.
And it's helpful to help people identify, we all bring our baggage to these issues, and sort of maybe deconstruct that before you then, because if you do that, then people can get to a place where they can say, okay, it's okay that the earth is 4.5 billion years old.
One thing
it may not be the facts of that are the problem.
Right, that's true. When you talk about the different kinds of truth, one thing I've done, both with junior high kids, but also with adult classes in appropriate ways, give them a sheet that has two different texts about the death of Abraham Lincoln. One of which is from a good biography of Lincoln, the kind of just the facts man approach, what happened in Ford's Theater. The other is Walt Whitman's poem, "O Captain, My Captain." That. Now, which one of these is more true? They're both true. They're different kinds of truth. You can talk about that in different ways. Yeah.
I would just also say, you can start the class, which is what I try to do when I give presentations on science and things. Your first class can be, what does the Scriptures tell us about the earth, a positive thing? Most of Scripture is about praising God for the beauty of the earth, and talking about what the Scriptures do focus on in a positive way before you get into this sort of nitpicky, controversial issue on
right. Okay, yeah. I don't want to. I have a math professor in graduate school who, if a question or about something seemed too persistent, at some point would say, "I have a certain amount of material I must cover in this course." Pick up his notes and start writing on the blackboard again. So I don't want to do that, but I do have some things I want to talk about. If you don't mind, if I won't be quite that rough. Do want to say a few other things. Here's a different approach for a different kind of class.
do a class, and you can do this with either high school students or adults. Class on science fiction and religion. Paul mentioned my book, Pulpit Science Fiction, which is a collection of science fiction story sermons. It was published by CSS. But you do a class on science fiction and religion, and do this by having the people in the class see a movie each week or every 2 weeks, let's say. And you don't show the movies in class. I mean, you don't have to spend 2 hours sitting there having to watch it there. Say, in 2 weeks we're going to discuss Contact. And then they can go to the library or go to the video store, and maybe they own it already or whatever, and they can watch that, and then you're going to discuss that.
So more likely to see a movie than read a book for the next class.
Well, that helps, yeah, that helps. But you can do that, and there are a number of movies that you can do this with. You can do it with Contact, which is the Jodie Foster movie that's based on a novel by Carl Sagan, which interestingly, in some ways, is better as far as the religious issues than the movie is, but anyway. The Matrix has some interesting angles you could take. The old Forbidden Planet film.
Oh, yeah.
You start thinking about the significance of evolution and original sin and so forth. Interesting point in that. 2001, of course, Gattaca, which is about genetic engineering and so forth. And you can do that with high school students, or I suppose junior high, too. So that's another angle on this. And of course, you have to then do some thinking, what really are the religious aspects of this? Because they're not explicitly religious films. In Contact, there is some discussion of that. But it's certainly not a theological take on things. Matthew McConaughey is one of the worst theologians in the history of the world. Now, I need to say a few minutes about another important aspect here, namely preaching. The person who is called to preach in the congregation is the one who ought to do the preaching. And guest lectures on science from the pulpit are not something that I want to encourage. In fact, I don't want to encourage lectures on science from the pulpit at all. Okay? If you're going to have a lecture on science, it ought to be from this kind of setting here. What comes from the pulpit is proclamation. Okay? Proclamation of law and gospel, but proclamation that makes contact with and helps people to deal with the issues of the real world. And that includes the issues raised by scientific and technological discoveries. And so that's the sort of thing that I mean when I talk about preaching in this area. And even though you are not called to preach, I don't know, maybe some of you are, but even if you're not, you can make a contribution, making the pastor aware, if you conscientize the pastor, that you're quite willing to be a resource on some things if he wants to deal with some of those issues in preaching. You could take a positive. You say, pastor, maybe you ought to talk about the issue of cloning in a sermon sometime, something like that. Be prepared to maybe give some guidance on that. If somebody makes some scientific error, if the pastor makes a scientific error in the sermon, be willing to tell the pastor privately and sensitively that that's wrong. Darwin was not converted to evangelical Christianity on his deathbed. In fact, there's a whole book by James Moore called The Darwin Myth about that. It is not true that in relativity everything is relative. just to take a couple of popular urban myths. And if the pastor's response is, that doesn't really matter, yes, it does. So you may need to be challenging. Somehow I don't mean to be nitpicky about it. Pi isn't really 3.1416, but, I don't mean to be picky about things, but serious things you need to be willing to challenge. There are other possibilities as well. As we said, and I'm glad you called my attention to, so I didn't forget to bring it up again, we certainly need to be concerned with junior high and high school classes as well as with adults. Of course, those require somewhat different approaches. Some of the reason, unfortunately, there are not a lot of resources that are really good for teaching these things with younger people. And we need more good work of that sort. to be done. But it's not necessarily leading a class. You could do the children's sermon. Something, tell the pastor you'd be open to doing the children's sermon if you have such things in your church. And, you could use some science demonstration and use that for kind of a little parable of some sort. Or, do some of those things with Vacation Bible School. You do something, you have some sort of fun time when you can do some science demonstrations for the kids and tie it in with creation. Environmental programs. Recycling, energy efficiency. I was on the Energy Audit Committee of the Diocese of Ohio at one point, trying to plan to get all the churches in the diocese to do this energy audit with the view, of course, toward not only saving money, but also contributing to environmental care. And by doing those things, number one, the way you can sell some of those things is we can save the church some money.
Yeah.
But you're also setting an example both for members of the church and for the larger community that the church really takes seriously this idea of care for creation. I mentioned already serving as a resource for the pastor, maybe in dealing with counseling or something like that on some issues. Now, I have a handout there, and some of you have given me other resources, and I put a couple on the board. Let me say I am quite happy to and quite willing to be a resource myself to the extent that I'm capable. And I put on the board my email address and also my website. Unfortunately, Google will probably give you my website on what is no longer my website because I changed the server. So that's the up-to-date one. And I would be happy, if you want to contact me, if you need any suggestions or ideas for how you can do this kind of thing, please feel free to contact me. On this list of resources, I put these things under several categories, and clearly there's a lot more stuff out there than what I've listed. I put Walt Hearn's book on science as a vocation, put a few books for theological background, and I could have chosen a lot of others. These are all books that somehow make contact with science. They're not just systematic theology texts. Dennis Edwards is Roman Catholic, a kind of interesting take on evolution and Trinitarian theology. Alistair McGrath's 3-volume scientific theology is not something that you're going to pack up and take to the beach next summer and read. It's pretty heavy reading. If you really want to get into that, that's one resource. Arthur Peacock, this book is kind of Peacock's Nunc Dimittis, because it was completed just shortly before he died of cancer. And he was quite aware that he was a terminal cancer patient. It is probably a good deal more liberal than a lot of ASA people would be comfortable with. There are a number of responses to his initial long essay by people kind of at different places in the theological spectrum, and then Peacock's own kind of response to the responses. But I think it's important to sort of know something about the theological spectrum dealing with these issues, not just here's what's in the tradition I'm comfortable with. John Polkinghorne's The Faith of the Physicist. Just looking at that title, you might think that that's sort of a, how do we know about God from science? Actually, what it is a commentary on the Nicene Creed from the standpoint of a physicist. So I think it's quite good. Resources for teaching. These are not all things that you could actually use as a curriculum. In fact, most of them aren't. I'm thinking of these more as resources for the person who's teaching, although a couple of them also are things you could give to a class. The first one, the Catechism of Creation, is an Episcopal resource. It's at the Episcopal Church's, National Church's website. I think it is quite good. It's in the Anglican tradition, but it's got a lot of good ecumenical resources and deals with a wide range of issues in catechism form connected with the doctrine of creation. The next two books there by Collins and Gingrich are both pretty popular books. I mean, popular in the sense of being non-technical, but also they're fairly popular in the popular sense. That first one dealing, of course, primarily with biological issues and evolution. Gingrich's book, more from Gingrich as an astronomer, so dealing with things from that standpoint. The book of mine that I've listed, Toward a Christian View of a Scientific World, is intended for use in adult classes in church. And it's kind of modular, at least some of it. In other words, you could pick and choose which chapters you wanted to deal with. I think a very good resource if you want to know about the range of views on evolution and creation is the book by Ted Peters and Martina Hewlett. Ted is a Lutheran theologian who has been involved with a lot of religion science discussions. Martina Hewlett is a Roman Catholic biochemist. And this evolution from creation to new creation gives a very good picture of the whole range of views from young earth creationism to atheistic materialism. So good, I think it's good. The Fred Van Dyke book is on a number of ASA-related authors talking about environmental stewardship. Now, I've listed 4 preachers, so if you want to, you could give preachers one or the other of these for their Christmas present, and hope they read it. I mentioned the Cole Turner and Waters book. That's not really so much for preachers, but more for pastoral counselors. The other 3 are dealing with preaching in different ways. Scott Hosey is at Calvin Seminary in Grand Rapids, and so of course has a Reformed take on things. The next one that I did with Levon Outhouse, who is a retired Lutheran pastor, and Russ Willis, who's United Church of Christ, is a commentary, or a series of commentaries, on biblical texts. And we tried to deal mostly in terms of the Revised Common Lectionary, but trying to deal with all the biblical texts that might be seen as having any relevance to issues of science and technology. And particularly with a view toward helping preachers address those things when they preach. Not necessarily to preach a whole sermon on these topics, but maybe if you want to just put in a comment, use a scientific illustration or something like that. And it's got a number of appendices which Russ put together, relating different lectionaries and listing different topics and topics by text and so forth. Jennifer Phillips, Preaching Creation Throughout the Church Year, again, has similar organization, but she's dealing more with focusing more on the environmental kinds of concerns and theology of nature. Okay, it is 3 o'clock, so I'm finished. I guess if anybody's got any questions, we can ask.
Just if I could just ask one quick question. Can you say a little bit about the work that you're doing in theoretical physics? You're working on a paper. Just give us a little flavor of what you're working on.
Well, it's something I have the luxury, as far as physics is concerned, doing anything I want to, including stuff that seems completely obscure. And I think sometimes looking at old theories and seeing maybe there really was something worth looking at in this after all. The approach to a unified field theory that Erwin Schrödinger tried to do in the 1940s and 1950s, rather similar to Einstein's last work on unified field theory, which most people nowadays think, well, that was interesting back then, but it's just history. And looking at this, I did work on this back 30-some years ago, and looking some more at it, I think Schrödinger's approach particularly, where you start with a non-metric space, or you have a space-time that has only an affine structure, and I know I'm using the technical terms, and then the metric structure comes in later, offers some possibilities for, number one, if I can use this terminology, renormalizing the cosmological constant, so you can get the right value of dark energy, which is a problem, because the dark energy that quantum field theory suggests is so huge that it would make the universe blow up in 10 to the minus 43 seconds. So as a possibility of making that the right size, and also I think has some possibilities for offering not a complete theory of quantum gravity, but maybe a better place to start on quantum gravity than some of the places that people have usually started. So
Great.
It's still in the works.
Okay, George. Well, thank you very much.